Welcome to the ISF podcast from the Information Security Forum. I'm Tavia Gilbert, and I'm glad to welcome you back to another cutting-edge conversation with business leaders and creative luminaries tailored to global security professionals. Today is the final episode in our special 4-part series on ISF's latest report, Threat Horizon 2023, Security at a Tipping Point. Today, we're focusing on the report's third and final threat: security fails in a brave new world. 2023 will be characterized by uncertainty and obfuscation, putting into question the enduring relevance of information security and its attachment to the principles of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Deep macroeconomic, social, and political changes will batter organizations, leaving them off balance and struggling to keep pace. As the information security function supports organizations in weathering this storm, it will be forced to confront its own shortcomings to explore and conquer this brave new world. I have to say, Steve, that after a year of COVID-19, crazy weather, crazier elections, this threat feels really daunting. So talk us through it, if you will.
It is daunting, I suppose. I mean, first of all, we foresee smart grids coming to an attack surge. The need for environmentally safe and sustainable energy will usher in an age of smart grids, and these grids will invariably inherit many of the flaws and the weaknesses found in immature and somewhat difficult to manage technologies. That's going to leave critical national infrastructure at a greater risk of cyber attacks than we've seen before. And as smart grids emerge, new models of power distribution will begin to arise, and that's going to create a complex supply chain of startups, high-tech companies, and established utilities. Now, that's all going to provide an extended attack surface that allows adversarial actors to target a single asset and create a series of cascading disruptions across the entire supply chain. So what does that mean? Well, it means that attackers will be able to hold energy suppliers to ransom, severely disrupting organizational operations, cutting off both upstream and downstream businesses that are dependent on a consistent power supply. And smart grids provide a particularly enticing prospect for attackers who wish to destabilize governments and businesses alike, creating civil unrest and plunging countries into darkness. The potential for regular and widespread power outages will, I think, drive organizations into a state of perpetual twilight, if you could put it that way.
Well, please do tell me there's something we can do to prevent this.
There are some things. I mean, organizations should certainly assess the mix of energy sources they use and the risk posed to maintaining availability of information. And a key aspect of this is to plan for energy resilience. For now, we're recommending that organizations perform initial risk assessments of their power dependency. They need to understand their level of resilience to prolonged or frequent power outages, and they need to be sure to perform continuous supply chain assurance on relevant energy suppliers.
It always comes back to that supply chain.
It does, doesn't it? We've talked about it so many times over the different podcasts that we've done. Long term, businesses need to review uninterrupted power supplies and reassess the ability of critical systems to recover from operational downtime. They'll want to evaluate options too, I think, for on-site power generation to reduce the risk of interruption and really alleviate some of that supply chain challenge.
Besides power concerns, the report mentions isolationism as a major threat. Can you talk about that a bit?
Organizations will find it progressively more difficult to maintain a consistent approach to security across global operations, as both legal and political changes erect obstacles to a strategic and holistic approach to security. Fragmented and disparate security silos, I think, are going to arise across borders, resulting in an increasingly costly and high-risk environment that challenges some of the conventional security practices that we've become familiar with today. I think as well that we'll see global events conspiring to push nation states away from established regional and international mechanisms in favor of an isolationist strategy that protects their national interests, and we're starting to see some of that happening already in terms of the way that cloud technology is being managed and where data is being stored and so on. With an increase too in the population of internet users in developing countries, or net newbies, these states will create diverging requirements for multinationals. And this will culminate in locally defined systems that rely on competing and sometimes incompatible security arrangements. So organizations, I think, are going to struggle. The CISO is going to struggle to understand the overall risk landscape as they all seek to maintain and patch an overwhelming number of systems that fulfill similar but not identical functions. And they'll be forced to adopt different standards and technology, for example, 5G infrastructure, encryption, and operating systems in separate geographies, and doing a lot of the work that organizations have really striven for in pursuing a global security strategy. We're going to see fragmentation. And not only will organizations potentially anyway see investments that they've made in the past go to waste through streamlining security controls, but they'll also have to introduce and really come to terms with some new vulnerabilities that are associated with maintaining a diverse and very disparate security architecture.
So how can businesses prepare for all of this?
Well, first of all businesses should expect to experience ongoing legal and regulatory change across the different jurisdictions in which they're operating. And so monitoring for potential changes will provide some of the time needed to prepare and put in place necessary security arrangements to stay compliant. At this point, organizations should probably just monitor legal and regulatory regimes in operating regions for some of those upcoming changes. Some regulators are particularly good at advertising the changes, others not so much. So I think the need to assess the impact of the way in which these changes are being brought about really will rest with the organization. The impact of isolationism too on the organization's supply chain and the availability of key suppliers in new or emerging markets for them is also something that they're really going to need to take into account. And it's important, I think, that all organizations in these situations identify sourcing options and workarounds for technologies and systems in markets that, if they're not restricted today, may become so. Longer term, I think that organizations need to be ready to engage with regulators to manage their expectations and influence future regulation. Now, clearly, that's probably going to be restricted to large organizations or organizations that are able to be part of various industry bodies. They'll need to map legal requirements of new markets to a matrix of existing security arrangements to really identify commonalities. ISF members will have seen some of this in the work that we did last year, for instance, in scoping out some of the changes in the regulatory landscape. And we really do recommend that organizations develop a security strategy to accommodate these net newbies that I was talking about and their different diverse requirements too.
And that brings us to the last point, which we've mentioned on the podcast already, I think, several times this year. This is the new normal, or the never normal. It's never going to be normal. We're not going to return to the way life worked in the recent past. And there's going to be a struggle to deal with that, to adjust to it, right?
Yeah, no, you're right. I think that, as organizations complete the long-term recovery from the global pandemic, they are going to face, unfortunately, in some instances, I think, a bit of a reckoning with rushed digital transformations. In the new world of the never normal, established policies, processes, technologies will no longer be fit for purpose, amounting to an accrued security debt and a workforce that's more vulnerable to attack than ever before. And while this sort of new world environment, if you like, has the potential to offer a wealth of new opportunities for growth, ingenuity, innovation, it's also one in which business as usual will be something of an unrealized aspiration. I don't see us returning to that I don't see it ever, to be perfectly frank. I think organizations will move away from central office and establish mechanisms of employee oversight, opting instead for, if not a fully remote or work from anywhere model, then certainly a hybrid. And this change from a managed, secured workplace to what is a fractured and disparate landscape will test previously proven security practices. Now, I know that some organizations also are indicating a return to the way that things were. I don't see that really coming about for the vast majority. I think we will see certain organizations able to do that, but the vast majority, I think, are going to be in this fast changing hybrid situation. The overwhelming accumulation of vulnerabilities, that then result from this security debt that I'm talking about will really drive this threat. Attackers will inevitably exploit weak points in security, taking advantage of immature, evolving business models and practices. And that's going to allow malicious actors to breach networks, undermine and disrupt operations, and even perhaps manipulate the workforce who are now spread across this sort of plethora of locations with varying degrees of access to valuable corporate IP and sensitive data.
It seems like the only way to work within this climate, then, is to implement changes to working practices in as considered and responsible a way as possible. The enduring repercussions for businesses and for security norms really have to be taken into account.
Yeah, I mean, businesses need to understand their new working environments and the location of employees, and they have to assess the risks associated with security debt. I'm coming back again to security is all about risk, it seems. But businesses do need to prioritize upgrading and delivering a security awareness program dedicated to remote working. It is a different environment. They should also really evaluate multi-cloud environments and look for ways to rationalize perhaps the use of some of these services, because I think there was something of a rush to the cloud as a means of storing information because it is easily accessible from anywhere. So those are some of the short-term things. I think longer term, organizations will need to rethink and realign the information security strategy with their revised business strategies. The two need to work hand in glove. And, as we've mentioned a few times in this series, as we've said for years, they need to undertake cybersecurity exercises and scenario planning to account for changing circumstances. And they'll have to reassess the security architecture associated with a distributed model of working. So lots of change in there.
Daunting situation. But it does help to know that there are steps that business leaders can take now to avoid becoming overwhelmed by this brave new world. As the world is shifting inevitably into, I think, a relentlessly turbulent era of change, organizations really have to strive to understand and respond to how their business operating models are being contorted. And strategies for business resilience should center, then, on securing those new and emerging hybrid working environments and ensuring that organizations can continue to adapt to this constantly changing world.
I think, security doesn't like change. And I think that one of the truisms that we'll be living through for the next number of years is that change is a constant. And people have talked about that before, but I think that from a security standpoint, the change hasn't been as impactful as it now will be, because there isn't anything that is a constant. You've always been able to rely on certain things in the security world that don't change. And I think that the speed and the rate of change will continue to increase. And whether or not people can ever keep up with that, remains to be seen. I'm not so sure. I think it comes back to, as again, and I say this so often now, it comes back to risk management. You have to figure out where you can get the best return on the time invested that's going to support what you're trying to do from a business standpoint most effectively. And in that risk assessment, you're going to have to take into account everything from compliance to people and skills and ability to implement along the way. So that's quite different, I think, for a lot of security functions in organizations.
Thanks so much for your time in this special series on the ISF's Threat Horizon 2023, Security at a Tipping Point. These discussions are always troubling, but it's been helpful to dig into the ISF's research and begin to prepare for the coming threats. The ISF podcast will be back in a few weeks with a new season of conversations focused on the workforce of the future. Until then, listeners, we invite you to tune into our catalog of video and podcast episodes, all of which you can find at securityforum.org. If you feel today's conversation was of value, you can follow the audio feed wherever you get your podcasts, and you can recommend us. Your endorsement helps us reach new audiences and helps us continue to bring you these timely discussions. You can always join in the conversation on our LinkedIn page by searching CEO Steve Durbin or Information Security Forum. Or you can get in touch directly through our website, where you can also download ISF's research, practical tools, and guidance related to discussions like these. The ISF podcast is produced by TalkBox and Tavia Gilbert. Associate producer Katie Flood. Music by Alexander Filipiak. Mix and master by Brian Barney. Thanks for listening.